Hello everyone. Today I'm going to explain the chapter from Footprints Without Feet, Class 10. The first chapter, A Triumph of Surgery by James Harriet. James Harriet, also known as James White, and he was a veterinary surgeon besides a writer, and he has written a series of books related to animals, pets, and their owners. This is a simple story related to mistress and her pet dog, Tricky. Here, the story is about a pet dog, Tricky, who is pampered by a rich mistress, and he becomes very fat, plump, lethargic, and then what happens to him? Let us go through the chapter. First of all, I would like to discuss about the title, A Triumph of Surgery. Triumph means victory over something, and surgery means, here it is meant for the hospital or the clinic where Tricky was treated by the vet surgeon James Harriet, the writer also. So I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the streets with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. So he talks about Tricky's appearance, who has become a blotted sausage. That means cylindrical in shape, fat, thick, and because he was a vet, he could see that it was a serious matter. So he had become hugely fat, like a blotted sausage with a leg at each corner, and his eyes bloodshot and rheumy. Bloodshot and rheumy, red, tired, exhausted, and then rheumy means it's a uh, watery discharge from the eyes. And then he's very astonished to see that the dog was not at all keeping well. So, Mrs. Pumphrey, who is the mistress, she hastens to explain he was so listless. Listless means that he did very little activity, and most of the time he lie down on a rug and then did not move at all, was still most of the time sleeping or doing something that was not so good for or healthy for a dog. So Mr. Harriet, he seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of uh, Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So Mrs. Pumphrey used to pamper the dog so much that she was worried all the time. And she was more worried because Tricky, who loved food, refused to have any. So she kept on pampering him by providing him Horlicks and cod liver oil and etc. So, and did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? The surgeon asked her. Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so Tricky was fond of sweets like cream cakes and chocolates. I can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog that was a trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. So particularly, he was a greedy dog, means he ate everything, anything, whatever he was fed, and therefore he was overfed sometimes by Mrs. Pumphrey, the mistress or the owner of the dog. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? So you see, it is also applicable for the children, that when sometimes they are pampered by their parents and they are given whatever they want, and then they have the wrong food habits. So in that case, what happens? Obesity. Of course, it leads to obesity. And then children nowadays, like, they don't take exercises, so ultimately, the energy is not burned, and hence it leads to obesity. So she made an excuse that the gardener was a little busy, and then he did not take him out for ring throwing or any other activities. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right now and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. So, exercise and diet both is very important for humans as well as for the pets. Appropriate diet and exercise makes a person healthy or makes the pets healthy. But if a pet or a child is overfed or underfed, both the cases there are health consequences. Well, Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. It's a kind of a woolen cloth, and Tricky was covered with a coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. So, as I said or meant that he was pampered a lot, not only with food but also with other comforts like dresses, coats, then cushions, and then so the wardrobe was full of his clothes for all seasons. Then the expected call came within a day, and Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. So now the matter turned very serious. So Mrs. Pumphrey, she called for the doctor again because Tricky was seriously ill, and the problem was that Tricky, who used to love food, now was not interested even in his favorite food or meal. And then he was lying down most of the time, and then he was vomiting bouts. So this was a matter of concern, and hence Mrs. Pumphrey was for the doctor. So the poor lady almost swooned. She became unconscious when she came to know that Mr. Harriet would like to take Tricky to the hospital. She was sure she would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. Because earlier he strictly told Mrs. Pumphrey to take care of the dog and not to give him, not to overfeed him or to give him a lot of exercises. But as she did not heed to his words, so he decided to take Tricky along with him there to his surgery, means to his clinic. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed and his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast ball, lunch ball, supper ball, etc. So it was decided that everything would go with Tricky, his all belongings. I mean, so the maids and the staff there in the house, everyone was busy collecting his things, packing and putting inside the car with Tricky so that he feels comfortable there in the surgery. So as I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So the whole house was very unhappy, and they were almost in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I no a cure for you. So as soon as they reached the surgery, the household dogs surged around me, means surrounded or came to see who had come. So Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him, and they again were busy with their play. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. So, Tricky was not given any food for the next 2 days. He was only fed with water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Whimpering is a low sound made when someone feels with pain, fear, or unhappiness. So, when I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. So, after rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed, then rolling slightly with his surplus fat. So now Tricky wanted to go outdoors and mix up with the dogs because he was not only feeling bored but he was also hungry. So when he saw that they were fed in a bowl, and then he too struggled hard to get some food from there, and when he could not because of his thick appearance or because he was too fat to fight for the food, so he waited long, and then after they had their meal, the dogs, after they had their meal, when they left the place, Tricky started licking the balls. That was a sign that he was feeling hungry. So the author decided, or the vet decided, to give him some food the next day. So from then on, his progress was rapid, and he had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. That means a confused struggle, a fight, usually the dogs indulged in. So now he started showing some activity, and because of these activity, one can easily make out that he was improving, his health was improving. So, all the while, Mrs. Pomfrey hovered anxiously in the background, and there she was not stable, or she was so worried about Tricky. Mrs. Pomfrey was so worried about Tricky that now and then she made a call so that she can get the latest updates about Tricky's health. So I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger. I was only able to tell her that he was improving and he was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pomfrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs and 2 dozen at a time to build Tricky's strength. Also, some bottles of wines began to arrive. But these things were not given to Tricky at all because the vet thought that it was not at all good for Tricky. So those things were mostly consumed by the author and his companion, who enjoyed the eggs and the wine. So it was temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. That's what he thought because of these arrivals. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. So altogether he was kept for 15 days there in the clinic, and then finally it was decided that Tricky must get back to his mistress. So within minutes, about 30 feet, and as soon as she was informed about this good news, she rushed towards the clinic, the surgery, and a gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery, the big car she possessed. So the chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her, lips trembled, and she was so excited and anxious that she felt, and she was so happy that she thanked Mr. Harriet. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." So he walked down through the house into the garden, and he saw that Tricky was there playing with the other dogs, and he caught hold of him and then took him to Mrs. Pumphrey, and she was so happy. Even Tricky was very happy to see his mistress, and immediately he, as soon as he took off from his arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap, and she gave a startled oh and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking because he saw her after several days. So during the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, whatever belongings were there in the clinic of Tricky was brought back again into the car so that it could be taken back home with Mrs. Pumphrey. And then tears shone in her eyes and lips, and she felt that he was being, operated, and a lot of medicinal treatment was done, and experiments were done on him, but actually it was nothing but only the exercise and the balanced diet that could help Tricky to recover from his obesity.